So today I wanted to talk about a time in history when comic books were so freaking scary that the government actually banned them. Comics similar to the ones you see here were just too much for audiences back in the 1950s. Well, that's what they were led to believe. Controversy surrounding comic books began in the 1930s, really, shortly after comics became a widespread medium. The first group to object against comics were educators. They saw comics as a bad influence on kids' ability to read and learn. They also said that comics ruined kids' tastes in literature. I think by now most people know that that's the opposite of the truth. Like, comic books are often a gateway into all kinds of other types of literature, you know what I mean? They were for me. I also partly learned to read with comic books. I learned proper grammar and spelling and all kinds of stuff from comics. Better than I did at school. But teachers started, publishing articles and stuff trying to convince people to wean their kids off of comic books like it's some kind of addictive drug or something. But I think the real issue there was that they saw comics as a challenge to their authority. Because this is something that a kid can choose to read on his own. He's like, I don't need you to hand me something that you want me to consume. This looks interesting to me, and I have agency, and I'm going to read this, right? And I think that especially back in the 50s, parents did not like that. Then, of course, churches and civic groups started adding their voices to, the protests about comic books, such as the scantily clad women in jungle adventure comics, and then the glorification of violence in crime comics, which were very, very popular. Then along came the Catholic Church, and their National Office of Decent Literature added a whole bunch of comics to the materials that it evaluated. Funny in hindsight, because what we know about the Catholic Church now, I don't think they have room to be telling anybody what's decent or moral. You know what I mean? Then after World War II, there was this cultural pushback against juvenile delinquency. That's when the mental health experts at the time jumped into the conversation. It's worth noting that back in those days, mental health treatment was abysmal. They were still lobotomizing people, which is just an abhorrent, barbaric practice. But among these mental health experts was Dr. Frederick Wortham.
The real question is this: are comic books good or are they not good? If you want to raise a generation that is half stormtroopers and half cannon fodder with a dash of illiteracy, then comic books are good. In fact, they are perfect. Just a very short while ago, an 11-year-old boy committed a holdup in California and killed a woman of 42. And when the police came to arrest this 11-year-old boy, his older brother, who's 20, said, if you want to know the cause of all this, here it is. It's these rotten comic books. Cut them out, and things like this would not happen.
And he started the campaign to ban the sale of comics to children, period. He said that children imitated the actions that they read from comic book characters, and that comics desensitized them to violence. Now you might notice that that sounds kind of familiar, right? We've been hearing that for video games for the last 20 years now. There have been studies that show that this is not true. So how was this guy so successful, this one guy? I mean, yeah, there were all these other civic groups and religious groups and stuff that were, on the same side, but this one guy became synonymous in history with, the comic book code and getting certain types of comics just completely banned. Because he advocated in professional venues, testifying at local legislative hearings and in national legislative hearings, and by publicizing his views in national media. He essentially was a one-man campaign against comic books.
It is my opinion, without any reasonable doubt and without any reservation, that comic books are an important contributing factor in many cases of juvenile delinquency.
At first, he couldn't get any traction. He couldn't get the federal government to pass any legislation banning comics. So that's when he turned to writing his book, Seduction of the Innocent. The book came out in 1954, and Wortham fired up his campaign again. He prompted the U.S. Senate Subcommittee of Juvenile Delinquency to begin its investigation into the effects of mass media with the comic book industry. Senators staged hearings in New York City on April 21st through 22nd and June 4th, 1954, calling just dozens of witnesses to testify. One of the most prominent to testify on the side of comic books was EC's William Gaines. EC is the publisher that used to publish Tales from the Crypt, horror comics. EC Comics was publishing the vast majority of the comics that they would use to, show parents panels from and how scary. Like there's that infamous cover with the guy holding a woman's severed head.
I was the first publisher in these United States to publish horror comics. I'm responsible. I started them. Some may not like them. That's a matter of personal taste. It would be just as difficult to explain the harmless thrill of a horror story to a Dr. Wortham as it would be to explain the sublimity of love to a frigid old maid. What are we afraid of? Are we afraid of our own children? Do we forget that they are citizens too, and entitled to the essential freedom to read? Or do we think our children so evil, so vicious, so simple-minded, that it takes but a comic magazine story of murder to set them to murder, of robbery to set them to robbery?
This is what happens when a few pearl-clutching people who think they know best for everybody start making broad claims about the entire industry, whether it's comic books or video games or anything, right? Like, not all comic books were horror comic books. But because horror comics existed, they got lumped in with all other comic books. It all became this mass of like, it's all bad, it's all evil, bad for kids.
There are no economic or racial lines to the comic book threat. They reach every strata. Kids read them in the North and in the South. Stories like Time to Die. They read them in living rooms in Dubuque and alleys in Manhattan. They read them in tree houses. They read them tucked into their notebooks in classrooms.
And the industry almost died because of it. In order to save the industry, publishers like Marvel, DC, EC, and a whole bunch of other publishers that you haven't heard of, because most of them have, gone the way of the dinosaurs since then, they formed the Comics Magazine Association of America, and they adopted a regulatory code, the Comic Book Code Seal of Approval. It was designed to look like a stamp, an official stamp, and it did. So you know what the Comics Code Seal of Approval was, but what is the Comics Code? The Comics Code was essentially the Bible for comic book censors. It went far beyond addressing anything about crime and horror comics, by the way. This is what happens when you try to do just a little bit of censorship, right? They were focused on horror and crime and stuff like that, but what ended up happening was the president of the CMAA outlined 41 problem areas, provisions that included sex, violence, and any other content not in keeping with critics' standards. Respect for government and parental authority was stressed. Censors even became the grammar police. So they were telling comics publishers exactly what words they couldn't use. The words horror and terror were banned. You couldn't say those. They also banned slang and colloquialisms. So anything that wasn't, proper English or anything that was kind of like a slang popular word was not allowed. As time went on, a lot of these pearl-clutching people, they didn't really care. It was all just about a political maneuver at that point, and led by a psychiatrist who, thought he knew more than he did. He didn't have studies to back him up. He did studies, but they weren't based on the scientific method. They weren't objective. They were just basically him looking for the results he wanted to have. The Comics Code lasted 60 years or so and ended in 2011. Over those years, the seal of approval became less prominent on comic book covers, and sometimes a publisher would even not use it because they wanted to, tell a story about drug use.
So I did a 3-issue series, and it wasn't preachy, but it had to do with a friend of Spidey's, I forget who it was, had taken too much of something. I don't know anything about drugs, so I just said he overdosed on something.
Right.
And he was on the edge of the roof and thought he could fly, and Spider-Man rescues him and says, you're a jerk for doing that type of thing. Mm-hmm. And it was part of a bigger story with a villain and so forth. Mm-hmm. So it didn't look like we were preaching. It was just an incident in a story. Mm-hmm. We then had the Comic Code Administration, where they were censoring all the comics. They sent the book back and said, you can't publish this book. I said, we won't put our seal of approval on. I said, why not? They said, well, you're mentioning drugs. I said, we're not telling kids to take drugs.
Right, showing the
and I
effects.
said, I was asked to do this by a branch of the federal government.
Right.
Sorry, you can't do it. Well, it's one time when I was very proud of my publisher. I said, Martin, I want to put these books out anyway. And he said, well, go ahead and do it, Stan. And we put them out without the seal. They sold beautifully. We got letters from church groups, parent teachers, so everybody loved it.
There's nothing inherent in the form of comic books that says that it's just for young audiences, right? Like, that's still somewhat a misconception among some people, that comics are just for kids. That's an archaic, old mode of thought that, unfortunately hasn't completely gone away. There's no reason why comics need to be catered towards kids or just adults or anything. It's such a broad medium, it can be anything. I understand limiting, access to certain comics for certain ages. That's more the parent's job than anybody else. If a parent doesn't want their kid reading something, they need to talk to their kid about that. And, the better thing to do as a parent is to, let the kid buy what they want and then talk with them about it. Talk with them about what they're consuming. What do they think about it? Give them a little context. You know what I mean? Marvel struck a major blow to the viability of the CMAA in 2001 when they withdrew from the Comics Code Authority in favor of their own in-house rating system. And then just 10 years later, only 2 publishers printed the seal of approval on the cover of their comics, Archie and DC. DC Comics announced in January 2011 that it was dropping the seal of approval, and very soon Archie followed. Today, publishers regulate the content of their own comics. The demise of the Comics Code Authority and its symbol, the seal of approval, marks elimination of industry-wide self-regulation, against which there was little recourse. If you disagreed with something, it's kind of like being a YouTuber and they make a decision and, oh well, sorry about your luck. Now, the comic book community answers its critics by exercising its First Amendment rights, assisted by the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, which is where I got the information in this video. The Comic Book Legal Defense Fund's whole mission is to protect those rights through legal referrals, representation, advice, assistance, and education. Please subscribe if you're not already, and I hope you have a happy, safe Halloween.
This comic book describes a sexual aberration so shocking that I couldn't mention even the scientific term on television.
You wanna do it in my butt? In my butt? You wanna do it in my butt? In my butt? You wanna do it in my butt? In my butt? Let's do it in the butt. Okay.